Okay, so when you think about the American Revolutionary War, your mind probably jumps to places like Lexington, Saratoga, or Yorktown, right? But what if I told you that one of its most critical conflicts happened thousands of miles away? A brutal, years-long fight for a tiny piece of rock that would literally help decide the fate of empires. This is the wild story of the Great Siege of Gibraltar, a forgotten battle that really did shape the world we live in. I want you to picture this. It's September 13th, 1782. This is the grand finale of a brutal 3-year-long siege. A massive French and Spanish fleet with hundreds of cannons on land is just unleashing an absolute storm of iron and fire on the British fortress of Gibraltar. This one day, known as the Grand Assault, was designed to be the final knockout punch. And the numbers here are just mind-boggling. On the attacking side, you've got a combined force of almost 60,000 French and Spanish soldiers and sailors, all of them laser-focused on this one tiny target. And defending the rock, a tiny, determined garrison of just over 5,000 British and Hanoverian troops. I mean, they were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, they were starving, and they'd been getting bombarded for years on end. So the big question is, how in the world could this little isolated fortress possibly hold out against that kind of overwhelming power? To really get the answer, we've got to rewind a bit and see how they got into this mess in the first place. So while the American colonies were fighting for their independence, Spain had a very different and, let's say, very personal reason for jumping into the war. This wasn't really about helping George Washington. For Spain, it was about one thing: revenge, and taking back a single vital prize, the Rock of Gibraltar. You see, back in 1779, Spain signed the Treaty of Aranjuez with France, and the terms were crystal clear. They would not make peace, they would not agree to any kind of truce until Gibraltar was back in Spanish hands. This wasn't some side quest for them. For Spain, this was the war. And make no mistake, the Spanish military was a serious force to be reckoned with. In August of 1780, in this brilliant naval move, a Spanish fleet intercepted a huge, heavily guarded British convoy. And the scale of what they captured, well, you can see it for yourself. It was staggering. 55 merchant ships, thousands of prisoners, and enough gear, like 80,000 muskets, to outfit a whole army. It was an absolute catastrophe for the British war effort, not just in America, but in India too. But amidst all this fighting, we get this really fascinating human detail from a captured British officer. He actually wrote about the great kindness and humanity of his Spanish captors. It's pretty amazing. Despite the ferocity of the war, the Spanish treated their 3,000 new prisoners with this remarkable generosity, following the established codes of honor for officers. But that kindness didn't change the financial reality. The total loss from that one convoy was £1.5 million at the time. In today's money, that's over £342 million. This single event sent shockwaves through London's financial markets, and it proved that the threat to Gibraltar was very, very real. Okay, so let's shift focus to what it was actually like on the rock itself. For the defenders, this siege was a living nightmare. For more than 3 years, they were cut off, starved, and just hammered by a relentless bombardment. Scurvy and dysentery were everywhere because there was no fresh food. One person described men who looked like they were suffering from decrepit old age, their limbs useless. They even suffered from these bizarre conditions like moon blindness, a kind of night blindness from severe malnutrition. Civilians were all huddled in this shanty town that the soldiers grimly nicknamed Coward's Town. And all the while, shells just rained down, completely leveling the town. The Spanish siege lines were creeping closer and closer. But there was this one spot, a sheer cliff on the north face of the rock, where the British just couldn't fire back from. It was a huge blind spot, and with no way to build a gun battery on the cliff face itself, the garrison was facing a seemingly impossible problem. So their solution was this incredible feat of military engineering. A sergeant major named Henry Ince suggested something that sounded insane. If you can't build on the rock, why not build inside it? And that's how the digging of the Great Siege tunnels began, a whole network carved by hand out of solid limestone with sledgehammers, crowbars, and a whole lot of gunpowder. So the men digging were practically suffocating from the dust and fumes from all the blasting. They were desperate for air, so they decided to just blast a horizontal shaft straight out to the cliff face for ventilation. And when the smoke cleared, they realized they hadn't just made a window, they had accidentally created the perfect protected opening for a cannon. Just like that, their blind spot was covered. But, as the British were getting clever, so were their enemies. The French and Spanish command was getting frustrated by years of failure. So they turned to a radical new superweapon, something they were sure would finally, once and for all, end the siege. Enter the floating batteries. There were 10 of them, designed by this brilliant French engineer, D'Arzon. They were pretty much what they sound like, floating fortresses, built on the hulls of old ships and engineered to be, well, completely indestructible. The design of these things was just remarkable. The sides facing the fortress were shielded by 3 feet of oak timbers, packed with wet sand to absorb cannonball impacts. The roofs were sloped to deflect shots and covered in wet animal hides to prevent fires. They even had an internal pumping system to constantly circulate water and douse any flames. Seriously, they were considered absolutely invincible. And that brings us right back to where we started, September 13th, 1782, the Grand Assault. Those invincible floating batteries are slowly towed into position, anchoring just 1,000 yards from the British guns. The final showdown is about to kick off. So the Grand Assault basically became a duel of technologies. On one side, you have D'Arcon's state-of-the-art floating fortresses, and on the other, the British countered with a technology that was brutally simple, but as it turns out, devastatingly effective: red-hot shots. At first, the British cannonballs were just bouncing off the battery's thick hulls, exactly like they were designed to. But then, the furnaces lining the British defenses started to glow. The gunners began firing cannonballs that were heated until they were literally white-hot. And these didn't just bounce off. They lodged deep inside the thick oak and wet sand, just smoldering and slowly burning the ships from the inside out. The invincible, fireproof design couldn't stop a fire that started deep within its own walls. The batteries were turned into inescapable floating ovens. By nightfall, the batteries were just burning wrecks. Their gunpowder magazines started exploding in these spectacular fireballs. And as the flames shot into the sky, the British commander, Sir Roger Curtis, led his sailors out in small boats under fire from both sides to rescue the survivors. They pulled 357 French and Spanish sailors from the burning inferno and the water. Yeah, the Grand Assault was a catastrophic, humiliating failure for the attackers. With their ultimate weapon destroyed and another British relief convoy on its way, the siege started to wind down. In February 1783, after 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days, the longest siege in British history was finally over. But that victory came at a horrific cost. This slide shows the final casualty report for the British garrison. Now, while 333 were killed in action or died from their wounds, just look at the number who died from sickness: 536. It turns out the real enemy wasn't cannon fire, but the slow, grinding misery of the siege itself. The successful defense of Gibraltar was a massive morale boost for a Britain that had just lost its American colonies. For Spain, it was a bitter, bitter defeat. This immense struggle, this forgotten chapter of the American Revolution, gave Britain a powerful bargaining chip in the peace talks and secured its control of a strategic gateway for centuries. It just goes to show you that sometimes the most important moments in history are the ones hiding in plain sight. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other hidden histories are right there in front of us?